Hello and welcome to live programming here at the Foundation. Let's see here. So I'm just figuring out how to do this. I have a new laptop, so I can actually do this from my apartment rather than having to go home to the suburbs to do this. I'm very excited. For those of you who are new here, I have a presentation that I'm going to work through over the next half hour to an hour. Entitled Saudi Arabia Gives Up. I'm going to be doing some sort of updating on Saudi Arabia that I think is necessary and that a lot of media organizations are not doing. If you're new here, we have a live chat that you should see on the side of your screen. There's a very lively group of folks who interact there. I encourage you to be as rude about me as you want, rip me to shreds, but please be civil to each other. If I notice that somebody's in there and just sort of aggressively being abusive to other people, I will block you. So please don't do that. If you have any questions while I'm doing the sort of presentation initially, keep in mind that I don't have the mental bandwidth to read those and remember those while I'm also talking about the stuff I want to talk about today. The second half of this will be probably about half hour to an hour of me doing Q&A. So just once the Q&A portion starts, just ask your questions again. So I think that's where we are. I'm happy to be live broadcasting again. It feels like it's been a while, and let's get into it. So what the title of this is: Saudi Arabia Gives Up. And I think that's kind of a key thing. Since certainly since 2015, with the accession of power of King Salman, and I think especially since 2016 and the launch of Vision 2030, we've been sold a bill of goods. We've been sold this idea of Saudi Arabia, reforming and changing, and we're doing all these things that are, going to make the biggest possible difference, and it's the new Saudi Arabia, and we're going into the future, and we're diversifying, and we're going to, this, that, and the other thing. And this was crucial. This has happened before in Saudi Arabia's past, but because of the oil markets, because of what has been happening with the oil price over the past 5 years, and what now looks very likely to continue to be happening for the next couple decades, it's not like the old school Saudi Arabia, sure, we're going to do this, we're going to spend a ton of money on this and never really follow up on it. I think in 2016, what people liked was that they saw there was a real urgency from Saudi Arabia saying, oh no, this time it matters because of, whether it's, new technologies, renewable technologies, or just the shale or efficiency everywhere. It seems likely that 10, 15 years from now, people are going to need less oil. So that means Saudi Arabia has to figure out something else. So it was urgent, it was important, and we were, given a whole bunch of things that were going to change and make things different. All of them have exploded. I mean, none of them are actually happening. And that's a tremendous, tremendous letdown, and something that people need to be more aware of and need to be paying more attention to, because Saudi Arabia really has given up on almost every aspect of this incredible reform program. Okay, let me correct that. Not every aspect. I'm about to go through. There are some very real, very important, and worthwhile changes worth celebrating that have been made, but it's the bits that were necessary to save Saudi Arabia, to save Saudi Arabian finances, to save the Saudi Arabian model that are simply not happening. And they've all been derailed. And nobody's really talking to the Saudis and being like, hey, what's going on? What are we doing? What are we going to do? Because the crisis is coming. And now Saudi Arabia is not doing anything to actually try to stop it. I should, before I launch into this sort of list of failures and cataclysms, I feel like it would be appropriate for me to acknowledge that there have been some very, very real changes that are both worth acknowledging and very impressive. I did a video, I guess from 2 years back at this point, celebrating it when Mohammed bin Salman, the um, now Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, gave a speech not condemning, but attempting to distance themselves from Wahhabism and religious extremism more generally. And that was kind of an extraordinary thing because as recently as like 2015, the prior king Abdallah, would convene these big conferences like, "What are we going to do about ISIS? The answer to ISIS is more religious conservatism. It's Wahhabism that's going to save us from ISIS," which is, of course, a ridiculous thing. So it was extraordinary that MBS would give a speech. I believe, yeah, it was November of 2017. I think between November of 2017. Yeah, it was November of 2017 or late October of 2017, where MBS got up, gave a speech, and said, "We're going to distance ourselves from religious extremism." That's extraordinary, and even more vitally, this move, no matter how real it is or is not, is being backed up with real changes. I question, and I would love to know how the degree to which this change has impacted on Saudi Arabia's outward-facing policies. So are all of the imams and all of the mosques across the world that Saudi Arabia funded, are they also stepping back from extremism, or are they sort of saying ISIS and Al Qaeda are bad, but you need to be more Salafi? Are they stepping back as well? I don't know. And I haven't seen any really good reporting on that. But what is happening is within Saudi Arabia itself, there have been meaningful, real steps away from the sort of religious extremism. There's the Committee for the Prevention of Vice and the Promotion of Virtue, basically the religious police. I think many people have heard that famous anecdote where, whether it's true or not, it's worth recounting, just this idea that the religious police wouldn't let women leave a burning building because they were not properly dressed or something along those lines. So it's just this Saudi Arabia for a very long time had a very extreme religious police to police its own people that had great powers, could abuse people, could arrest them for improper dress, improper action, this, that, and the other thing. Under King Salman, my understanding is that has largely faded away. And there are absolutely new freedoms in Saudi Arabia. And I think that is to be applauded. And now there's a flip side to this. There's this new freedom for sort of the mass, for young people. A big appeal of Mohammed bin Salman, of MBS, as he's known, is the fact that he's very, very young. And because of Saudi Arabia's demographic structure, most of the people in Saudi Arabia are very, very young. I mean, it's some absurdly high percentage of the population is under the age of 30. So for those people, and those people are sort of still, I think, a big source of support for MBS. For those people, there are freedoms growing. It is becoming a less fanatical culture. It's very highly publicized when there's a concert or movie theaters opening. For people who actually want political change, for the people who agitated to bring about a lot of these things are actually quite possibly worse. There are many stories about the abuse of women's rights activists, torture, executions. I mean, it's a whole mess. So I don't want to get too kumbaya and la-di-da about this, but because it's been an interesting thing where there have been more freedoms for sort of the general public and less freedoms for the people who've traditionally run the country, less freedoms for the intelligentsia. Jamal Khashoggi would be a great example. The Washington Post columnist who was sort of a voluntary exile from Saudi Arabia, who was cut to pieces in the Saudi consulate in Istanbul. So it's both of these things are happening, but it is at the outset worth acknowledging that Saudi Arabia is changing in ways that are interesting and vaguely hopeful, but not hopeful enough. Also, I go back and forth on this, but I think some of this change was kind of inevitable. This sort of the level of extremism that Saudi Arabia supported domestically is it doesn't even necessarily go back to the 20s and sort of the founding of the modern Saudi Arabian state. It absolutely was extreme and religiously extreme back then, but it was in the context of a people that were, tremendously uneducated, tremendously, that were essentially medieval in a lot of their outlook, opportunities, and worldview. So it made sense for them to be extreme. In the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, today, Saudi Arabia has been wealthy and has really lifted up its population. I think literacy rates are high. It's a whole new thing. And this sort of quick turn towards extremism, even with this literate population, only started in, sort of the 70s, 80s, in response to a number of geopolitical considerations I'm not going to get into right now. So I think it was natural that this was going to break down eventually. You sort of spend half a century. Once you get money, you spend half a century getting rich, and then you get bored and you sort of move on. Once you've been rich for half a century, you spend half a century. Once you get rich, getting crazy religious, and then you get over it. This is a dynamic we've seen over and over and over again. I talk about it in my short book, Everybody's Lying About Islam, about the US-Saudi relationship that you can find on Amazon. So I do think that while MBS should be applauded for moving the domestic politics of Saudi Arabia away from extremism a bit, I do think it was something that kind of had to happen. So I don't know. Also important, I think it's very easy to be dismissive of this because, it's like, oh, this is sort of a Band-Aid on a problem, but women driving matter. I spent yesterday reading a pretty extraordinary sort of diplomatic history called Kings and Presidents, talking about US and Saudi Arabia. And just sort of reading about that, women driving is important. Activists have been arrested, have suffered for that for 30 years. And it is important that women are now allowed to drive. It's sort of a caricature of that's definitely part of the Saudi Arabia PR campaign, is pointing to women driving, but women driving is important. And Saudi Arabia is changing. The population is becoming more educated. These are all good things, and I think MBS to some extent can get some credit for this. And that's at the outset, that's something to applaud. Also, a very interesting, Princess Rima bint Bandar is going to be the new ambassador to the United States. So a female ambassador to the United States is pretty extraordinary, actually. And there's a whole bunch of caveats to this. I think actually this political move kind of makes me think that MBS's power is being cut out at the knees, which is good in some senses and bad in other ones. But still, one of the more powerful people in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, and the steward of the US-Saudi relationship that keeps Saudi Arabia going, is now apparently going to be a woman. That's not nothing. That's quite a lot, in fact. So okay, there we go. That's the throat clearing here. There have been good things happening in Saudi Arabia over the past 4 years. Society is changing for the better, but there's a fundamental disconnect here. The stuff that's happening is good, it's great, it's long-term, we'll put them in better stead, it's impressive, it's great, but none of it's really far enough. As I talked in my first video on this topic, Saudi Arabia is finished. I talked about how, it was absurd that, the Vision 2030 program sort of envisions Saudi Arabia being turned into Dubai or some other city in the United Arab Emirates, sort of these expat party cities where, they're business hubs. Opening a movie theater, having an occasional concert, that's not going to really do the trick. it's not going to really, get the money that Saudi Arabia needs. And that's the fundamental disconnect that I was talking about. Just Saudi Arabia needs money. Specifically, Saudi Arabia needs, I mean, not in the short term, but, in the medium term, not the long term, but the next 5 to 10 years, like Saudi Arabia needs to have a whole new business culture, essentially a whole new economy. And it was the acknowledgement of that prompted the Vision 2030 diversification program in the first place. So there are social and cultural changes that are totally worthwhile happening in Saudi Arabia, along with a bunch of political repression and insanity that's not good. But the economic changes, the reforms that really mattered, the reforms that were going to provide the basis for Saudi Arabia moving forward and evolving into a new and better country, they're gone, just done. It's pretty extraordinary. There are no economic changes that are going to be made. I mean, there are some, but they're minor. They're shuffling the deck chairs. They're not enough, I think, is the way to put it. So let's talk about, this program of change that was going to make everything different. So Vision 2030 is this massive diversification program. I think Vision 2030 might technically include everything, including mega projects. This is basically by 2030, Saudi Arabia is going to be a very different place with a great economy, and is tremendously reliant on foreign investment, which is something that's not fully recognized, I think, in any of the reporting on this. So there's Vision 2030, but the fact that it was very reliant on foreign investment isn't completely true, because they had, and this was a very convenient crutch in all of the sort of promotional pieces that outfits like the New York Times ran, was like, oh no, we have an answer of how we're going to pay for all this amazing Vision 2030 stuff. We're going to do the Aramco IPO. We're going to sell a chunk of ownership in the most valuable country in the world, Saudi Aramco, the Saudi Arabian state oil company. So you've got Vision 2030, you've got the Saudi Aramco IPO. And I think really most importantly, it's not, it is on the website actually. It's not sort of, I think it's more apparent than sort of spoken about, was that Mohammed bin Salman himself was a tremendous part. That's MBS, as he's known. Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince of Saudi Arabia, was a tremendously crucial part of this program because of who he is. Saudi Arabia, for its entire modern existence, since Ibn Saud came, screaming out of the desert, took the holy cities in the 1920s, and then founded the modern state of Saudi Arabia in the 1930s. Ever since then, and since the founder's death in 1953 or so, the country has been ruled in a very strict sort of consensus-based, not strict, but very consensus-based way by that man's family. So Ibn Saud had like something like 50 to 100 kids, maybe hundreds, I don't know. And all of his descendants are members of the Saudi royal family. So the politics of the kingdom up until, from 1953 up until 2015 were about which of the sons of this great founder was going to be king next. And it was consensus-based. It was sort of the family decided things. There was some, there definitely, there was some unpleasantness with Ibn Saud's direct successor, sort of confusingly named King Saud. But then sort of after that, they sort of figured it out. And, it just sort of went from brother to brother to brother to brother. And it was sort of a cozy way to run the country, to run the succession to the crown. But it had sort of run into a serious biological block. The current king was born in 1935, and he was one of the youngest sons of Saudi Arabia's founder. So this was a key problem. This is a real issue that, for the last couple of kings, they've had serious health issues. And then they're succeeded by somebody with serious health issues. I don't know if you've ever seen a picture of King Salman, the man who's, only been the king of Saudi Arabia for 4 years, almost 4 years at this point. I mean, he looks frail. I mean, he's an old man. He's so what, 1930? So yeah, he's in his 80s, late 80s, mid 80s, and he's not in great shape. So MBS, Mohammed bin Salman himself, is a tremendous reform program. This idea that this young prince who has those affinities with Saudi Arabia's very young population was going to be injected into the succession was, well, there's two things about this. The first is that this is actually really has created a tremendous amount of tension in the Saudi royal family. Sort of most famously, we saw in November 2017 the way that King Salman arrested a lot. Sorry, not yeah. Well, yes, King Salman technically, but supposedly motivated by the Crown Prince MBS, arrested a lot of the richer people in the country and in the royal family. I mean, this is what used to be sort of a. I mean, people got assassinated. There was bad blood, but what used to be sort of a civilized, consensus-based way to run a kingdom and the succession has gotten very, very contentious and problematic very quickly. But with MBS, he also, this King Salman, by putting MBS into the succession, has thrown everything up in the air. But it's also very hopeful, and it's the idea of, okay, we've just solved the problem of this old gerontocracy that had no idea how to do anything other than run an oil market, because we've got this young, fresh new guy who knows everything, and he's going to figure it all out. And woohoo! So those are the sort of the three prongs of what we were promised. What the world investing community was promised was Vision 2030, the Aramco IPO, and Mohammed bin Salman himself, sort of MBS, this brand new savvy prince who's going to bring new vigor and possibility to the Saudi system. So basically, all of those have fallen to pieces. I think perhaps the best place to start would be with the Aramco IPO. That's a quick one. I've got some videos on this, specifically the Aramco IPO is just never happening. If you go to my page and just Google Mo Freedom Foundation Aramco IPO, you should be able to find the video. But it was always kind of ridiculous. The idea of an initial public offering it's not a format that makes sense for selling off chunks of your large state oil company. I think it was viable. It made sense that that Saudi Arabia would want to sell a chunk in that, sort of out of desperation, and it was a way to make a ton of money. But in order to sell a chunk of Saudi Aramco, they would actually have to tell people what was going on with Saudi Aramco. And Saudi Aramco, it is almost certainly the largest company in the world. Nobody really knows what it's worth because it's got a lot of responsibilities outside of the fact that it, manages this incredible oil bounty. It's one of the best run institutions in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, and its importance to the Saudi government goes far beyond the fact that it's a business that makes money. It's actually Saudi kings will ask the Aramco company to go and do things that have nothing to do with oil, just because they're competent and they're good at things. There's a lot of weird legacies there. I mean, it sort of grew out of Aramco is the name, which I believe initially stood for Arabian American company. So there's some weird colonial aspects to it as well. So the idea that Saudi Arabia the government of Saudi Arabia would ever let control of this go, or even let people really know what was going on with this company, was always kind of farcical. So since the Aramco IPO's announcement, I think that was in the beginning of 2016, we've just gotten this constant climb down. And like the IPO is going to be, first it was going to be, sold in shares in New York and London, and then New York and London were like, I'm sorry, we can't work with this. You're not giving us enough information or details to justify any of this. It's impossible. So that wasn't going to happen. And then they were going to sell it on their own stock market, and it's going to be fine, and it's going to be great. And then that sort of, petered out a little bit. The most recent thing that I think is the only one I haven't covered on the channel so far is about 2 or 3 months back. It came out that, oh, actually, no, the Aramco IPO is just going to focus on the downstream assets of Saudi Aramco. So we're basically offering 5% of a bunch of stuff that's not really that important. The sort of upstream, downstream distinction, if I can remember this correctly, it's been a while since I was an oil industry analyst. The sort of upstream is exploration, production, getting oil out of the ground. I mean, this is what makes Aramco so extraordinarily valuable and interesting a company, is all of that. Their control of all of Saudi Arabia's reserves. That's upstream. So the most recent thing is that the Aramco IPO that's now supposedly happening in 2022 is just the downstream assets. So like refineries and, pipelines and crap, and 5% of it. And it's not going to be sold in New York or London because, they don't want to tell you anything about it. So, I mean, maybe China will stump up for some of this, in the interests of having, an in Saudi Arabia. The United States sure wouldn't like that. But yeah, no, it's farcical. So this thing that they're going to use to pay for everything, the Saudi Aramco IPO, is a joke, and it's gone. And it's happening sometime in the future, and it's not, even when it supposedly happens, it's not going to provide anything of value. Okay, so let's talk about Vision 2030. Vision 2030 is this idea that Saudi Arabia is going to completely transform itself. It's going to become a hub for biotechnology and technology and computers and this and green technology and solar fields and this, that, and the other thing. This has involved a tremendous amount of outside investment by Saudi Arabia, but the key aspect of this that was really, really underreported, I found that the whole point was none of these projects, none of these amazing things that were going to change everything were at all possible without massive, massive foreign investment. And that was sort of the point of this whole roadshow that MBS had been doing, the public relations blast, and none of that's really materialized. Even before the crisis and nightmare of the Jamal Khashoggi murder, even before that, none of this was materializing because I think there are people who've sort of fallen for the bullshit line of Vision 2030. Hard-nosed business people have prejudices too, and there's a lot of people. I've talked about this a lot on my channel. There's a lot of people who believe that oil prices have to go up. This is the way that it's been for the past 50 years. So not 50 years. The cycles are much shorter than that. But this is the way it's been for the past 15 years. This is the way it's been for my whole career to this point, or the whole bunch. Saudi Arabia must be a good investment. People believe this sort of thing and get sort of snookered and sucked into it. But when people actually looked at the details of these mega projects that Saudi Arabia was proposing, there's NEOM, the $500 billion city, that nobody lived at before. There's nuclear plants and solar fields and new refineries, just all this stuff. There was no there. Foreign investors were being asked to build these massive projects, get excited about being in a place with very real drawbacks. So yeah, the Vision 2030 thing was never working. And then, as my first video on the Jamal Khashoggi catastrophe, the horrific murder there, stated, at that point, Vision 2030 was well and truly dead. There's just no way you come back from that. The whole point. Also, I should mention, I think I mentioned briefly in November 2017, the fact that Saudi Arabia arrested all the richest and most powerful people in the kingdom, put them in the Ritz Hotel, may or may not have tortured people, and let some of them out when their money, when they took their money away. That was a very smart, no, not smart, but that was a short-term solution that made some sense. There's estimates that the Saudi government netted $100 billion worth of assets. But what they also did was they abused and dispossessed Saudi Arabia's business class. Granted, yeah, I mean, sure, they were crazy, corrupt people who were rich for no good reason, but still, like, these are the people who knew the other rich people in the world. These were the people who, would have been the people that foreign folks were interacting with in Saudi Arabia. And the Saudi government arrested them and put them in jail. Like, if you're trying to, I mean, that's like Stalinist tactics, like dispossessing the rich people. If you want investors to come into your country, dispossessing the rich people is not the way to do it. Obviously, slaughtering journalists is not the way to do it. I mean, interestingly, I mean, Khashoggi was not. I mean, this is horrible, but you can, depending on where you're at, what the country is, you can be abusive to journalists. But Khashoggi was a tremendously well-connected member of the Saudi Arabian elite, and also a well-connected member of the Washington, D.C. elite. MBS sort of quickly showed himself to be kind of a lunatic. So yeah, Vision 2030 is, dead. And there's no way to pay. And there's no way to pay for it either. So yeah, how is this to be taken seriously at all? So that's the Aramco IPO is bunk. Vision 2030 is bunk. And now there's MBS himself. Great marketer, or I suppose, anybody can be a great marketer if you've got billions of dollars. So yeah, he was rolled out over and over and over again as he just sort of moved up in the succession. Every time he was, got bumped up in the succession. I mean, first it was crazy that he was established as the deputy crown prince, I believe, back in 2015, just a couple months after King Solomon's accession to the throne. Don't quote me on that. And then was it in early 2017 or 2018? And then later, when he was bumped up to become the deputy to become the crown prince, kicking out somebody else who was important in Saudi politics, Mohammed bin Nayef. I can't pronounce any of this stuff. Then he got a new rollout. He got a new launch in the U.S. and world media. So it's not, he's the new crown prince, and he's been the brand new crown prince for 5 years now, which is not does not make sense. The truth is that he's been tremendously powerful in Saudi Arabia since 2015. I believe he got the defense minister portfolio back in 2015, and he's been a disaster. His signature programs, his signature foreign policy moves have all been abject failures. They have successfully bribed Donald Trump, which, that's not very difficult. It's Donald Trump. This isn't me being spurious. This is documented. Whenever the Saudis come to town, they rent out multiple floors of Trump's hotels in New York and Washington, D.C. It's straight up third world, money for services bribery. It's quite disgusting. But yeah, I mean, that happens. That's reported. So yeah, the Saudis have successfully bribed Donald Trump, but that's about it. And as has been proved over and over and over again, owning Donald Trump doesn't mean a goddamn thing. That guy has screwed over everybody he's ever met in his life. I've got a good video on this, which I think the Saudis learned the truth about Donald Trump. Because over and over again, the Saudis have given Trump the opportunity to do what, supposedly we all want. I mean, not anybody in the U.S. public, or probably even the Saudi public, but what the U.S. and Saudi government supposedly want is a big war with Iran. And MBS has given Trump multiple opportunities for that. There's the Qatar crisis. There was arresting the Lebanese prime minister. All of these were opportunities for this big war that the U.S. and Saudi government supposedly want, and Trump has just sort of whiffed on it every single time, which is fantastic and better than I'd expected. But yeah, so the Saudis are just getting burned, and Yemen. Yemen is horrific. I've got a whole playlist on Yemen on the channel. What the Saudis are doing to Yemen is nightmarish. much. And it is to the eternal shame of the United States that we are endorsing it. It's funny. It's not funny. It's obscene that we've got a whole bunch of people in Washington, D.C. currently, terribly bothered by the starving Venezuelan people. And yes, there is food insecurity and malnourishment in Venezuela, and it's terrible. And the Maduro government is, bad for doing that to its own people, but it's its own people. We're doing that to the Yemenis right now. And, I haven't read anything about this, but, it's interesting. I see a lot more like pictures of legitimately starving people in Yemen, like not like, once again, like what's happening in Venezuela is horrible, but they're human skeletons walking around in Yemen. And the United States is doing that to a foreign country. Fundamentally, if you're mismanaging your country as Maduro is and creating terrible things, that's bad, but it's still your country to a degree. There's some legitimacy. The United States is working with Saudi Arabia to starve and murder Yemenis halfway around the world from the United States. Saudi Arabia would not be able to do it if it weren't for us. So that's sorry, I can get very serious and angry about Yemen. So that horror show started in 2015 with Mohammed bin Salman as defense minister. So this guy's just not good at stuff. So what's interesting here is how bad MBS has been at stuff. And what's interesting since the Khashoggi thing is that even with all of the horrible, terrible things that MBS had done, even with how bad he was at government, he was still the power. He was still in power. And especially with this appointment of the ambassador this past week, I believe that he's been reined in. I believe that he's lost a lot of power in the Saudi infrastructure, in the Saudi hierarchy. And that's interesting. On the one hand, that's excellent because he's been a disaster. He's not good at things. He's a lot like Jared Kushner in that sense, the sort of sons of privilege who are bad at everything. He's terrible. He's somehow managed to convince his father that he's worthwhile at anything, and he's not. So it's great that he's been reined in, but on the other hand, that's the third prong of the incredible changes that Saudi Arabia was supposedly making that it has been knocked out completely. If MBS has now been chastened and locked down and put back in to a more traditional Saudi governing structure, then to some extent, obviously not all the way, but to some extent, we're right back where we started. We've got Saudi Arabia run by this gerontocracy of princes that aren't really good at anything, who really know only how to run Saudi Arabia in the context of ever more expensive oil prices. So yeah, we're back to the disaster. We're back to the crisis, and it is a crisis. Specifically, the figure, the Princess Rima, who's the new ambassador to the United States, is fascinating. She, seems, very impressive. I can be nothing but impressed by a woman, even with all the advantages she's been given, who's managed to, make a name and a career for herself in Saudi Arabia. And she's been doing that for something like 20 years. She was, you might remember, the famous Saudi ambassador to the United States, Prince Bandar. He's quite rightly, I believe, a key figure in a lot of 9/11 conspiracy theories, but he was the Saudi ambassador to the United States for something like 20 years. One of his nicknames is Bandar Bush, because he was that close to the Bush family. So Princess Rima is his daughter, which is kind of extraordinary. And one of the, I'd recommend Bruce Fradell's Kings and Presidents. Reading that last night, and one of the things that King Salman did as part of this coming to power and sweeping out the old guard and putting in the new was firing Prince Bandar. So it's very interesting that his daughter is now the ambassador to the United States. I think that once again, this is an incredibly powerful position in Saudi Arabia. I'm sure that it can be marginalized or what have you, but this is kind of key. Prior to um, Princess Rima, the ambassador to the United States from Saudi Arabia was one of Mohammed bin Salman's little brothers, and I think they share a mother as well, which is very important. So someone who was very close and very subservient to MBS was the U.S. ambassador to the United States. He, I think, got along with I think the Saudi foreign minister got canned because their lying over the Khashoggi incident was so egregious. So yeah, MBS's brother was sent home, and the daughter of one of the princes that King Salman fired when he came to power in 2015 is now going to be representing Saudi Arabia in the United States. That's pretty extraordinary. Um, Now, the whole Saudi royal family is organized in factions according to which of the sons you're descended from, and even, and of those sons, their factions, broader factions because they might have shared the same mother. So I have never bothered to map all that out, and I never will. My expectation is that nobody will have to know about that, 10 years from now. So I'm not going to learn it. But what the key point here is that this new ambassador of the United States is from a different faction, is not of, Salman and MBS and company. So I think there's a distinct chance that sort of saner heads have prevailed, and they're trying to bring back this sort of consensus thing, which means that good, Saudi Arabia has lost its deranged wrecking ball of leadership from the crown prince, but also bad because Saudi Arabia is in a bad enough position that it needed a deranged wrecking ball, a deranged wrecking ball that did, knew how to do better things than MBS did. So of course, none of this is set in stone or established. MBS is the crown prince, and his father is still alive, and he is the king. So it's quite possible that this is a temporary thing. Princess Rima will, last 6 months as the ambassador, or she'll be completely, maybe she'll have to stay there, but she'll be sidelined in some way. Any of that is possible. But for right now, it looks like all of the reform programs that were initially proposed are just in rubble, and the problem has not been solved. I'm not sure if I've sort of mentioned that, but the problem with Saudi Arabia is that it is dependent on oil prices. Everybody knows that, but it's been sort of ratcheting up, especially since the Arab Spring, the amount of money that it has to spend to stay in power. The sort of Saudi royal family, that regime, the amount of money that it has to spend to pay it stay in power has ratcheted up for the whole existence of Saudi Arabia, but especially now as the Saudi people are more educated, more literate, more capable of networking through social media. That amount of money they have to spend just keeps going up and up, and the estimates vary. But somewhere the oil price needs to be somewhere around $80 a barrel of oil for Saudi Arabia to continue paying its bills. And it hasn't been there for 4 or 5 years now. Yeah, occasional spikes and then down, up and down, up and down. I've got hours of coverage of oil price stuff if you're interested on the channel. But the fundamental message is that oil prices are going to be lower for longer. And especially if the electric car revolution materializes, it's going to get quite disastrous. And that's the reason they went on this reform push. That's the reason MBS was, appointed, upending, almost a century of tradition. And now Saudi Arabia is not doing anything, and it's just sort of looking down. He's just sort of happily traipsing down the barrel of a gun. MBS was traveling the world, meeting foreign potentates over the past couple of weeks. To what end? Nobody can really say. Saudi Arabia has given up. I mean, that's fundamentally what we're talking about here. They've just sort of given up on trying to solve this crisis that's impending. So I think that's a lot of support for my general thesis that Saudi Arabia, as it currently is finished. So yeah, there we go. I think that's 45 minutes. I think that's a good solid. That's a good solid bit. Have we got questions? Have we got questions? I'm trying to think if I have any corrections to issue for the past month of videos. Nobody's. You guys are usually better. You usually find mistakes in the videos I've done over the past month. But maybe I've just gotten flawless. No, maybe I've just gotten super paranoid now because so many of you are watching or paying attention. Logo Cool Extreme asks, Mo Freedom Foundation, is there any way to save Saudi Arabia? That's an interesting question. I think that I don't think the Saudi royal family has a future in Saudi Arabia. I think it's going to be Arabia. That's my hunch. I can be completely wrong. I mean, what the hell do I know? But I think the Saudi royal family, 10 years from now, is going to be living, the richer ones are going to be living on the French Riviera, and the poorer ones are going to be living in the Washington, D.C. suburbs. I think that's most likely what's going to happen. It's just not sustainable. The classic calculus that the Saudi government made was that they had to they worked closely with religious fundamentalists to maintain legitimacy. It's great. It's fantastic that they're distancing themselves from that MBS is distancing themselves from that. But like, what do they have left? Like, we're just a rich monarchy, one of the only ones left in the world. Like, come support us. There's no repeal there. It doesn't make any sense. The only way that it makes sense is if they're rich enough to keep sort of fire hosing money at everybody, and they're not anymore. So there's that. Was there something I wanted to? Yeah, there's something I did want to talk about, and I noticed a question about the upcoming Israeli election from Ross, which honestly I have not been up on it. As longtime viewers know, I have a very fraught relationship with the Israel-Palestine issue. I just don't want to cover it because I'm a coward, I think. I've got a lot of a big audience in the United States that sort of takes in Zionism with its mother's milk. And I've got a lot of an audience abroad that I think makes a lot of assumptions about Israel, its power of the United States that are also pretty farcical. So I'll eventually have to get there, but no, I haven't taken the time to follow the Israeli election. I mean, at the end of the day, it's a country of what, like 7 million people? Like, am I really obligated to know what's going on there? Anyway, but I do actually want to talk briefly about the Saudi-Israeli peace thing. That was part of my agenda that I didn't get to. Reading this book, Bruce Riedl's Kings and Presidents, over the past couple of days, it's just been really underlined for me how heretical MBS's approach and, King Solomon's approach to Israel has been. Now, there's been no, it's not like, MBS and Netanyahu are shaking hands or something like that. But it's kind of extraordinary what a departure this has been. I mean, King Abdallah, the king right before King Solomon, the guy who reigned up until 2015, was tremendously invested in the Palestinian issue, both politically and personally. And that's, as Riedel points out, when the founder of Saudi Arabia met up with U.S. President, Great Depression, World War II, U.S. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, when they met, historically on a ship. One of the main things that in the first meeting between a Saudi king and a U.S. president, one of the things that he emphasized was the Palestinian issue. Before there was an Israel, the Saudi kings were tremendously invested in basically the Palestinian cause and being against Israel. So I think there's a lot of people in the U.S. press, U.S. media who are like, "Oh, Saudi Arabia and Israel are, looking kind of friendly. Isn't this exciting?" And I think it's savvy. No, it's not savvy. I think it makes some. No, it doesn't make sense. I think it is tremendously dangerous for a Saudi king to do that. And I think that it is a sign of deep desperation. Also, I think that from the Israeli perspective, it doesn't make any sense at all, because you're sort of cozying up to one faction of the Saudi royal family that is dependent on, oh gosh, the 80, high 80 something King Salman and, Deputy Crown Prince that has just proven himself to be nightmarish. And I think that the Saudi royal family will fall, but I think before we get there, there will be, MBS will be out the door, and we'll have a succession of Saudi princes, as it all falls to pieces. But those guys are not going to be pro-Israel. The country that emerges eventually, whether it's a batshit caliphate or a functioning democracy like Switzerland, is not going to like Israel. So it makes no sense for Israel to be catering to this fantasy that the Saudis and the Israelis are going to be fun. The fundamentals here are just so. There's just so much negativity there. I just don't see it as possible. And of course, you could have said, "Oh, it's impossible that Egypt would have made peace with Israel." But yeah, Israel and Jordan made peace with Israel. But the only reason that that's still there is because that's reliant on the crushing of democracy in Jordan and Egypt. So yeah, it's just not a good long-term bet for Israel. And I think both. I think Israel and Saudi Arabia are sort of mistaking catering to the United States and the prejudices of the U.S. public and the interests of the Middle East peace. That sounds great, and I think they're really putting themselves in some pretty serious jeopardy, not just with their own people, but I think with the world public at large. Israel in particular is just sort of operating like it's still 1948 or the 1960s or 70s, where there's still this sort of scrappy country that needs to do anything to survive, and they're in this existential crisis, and everybody's trying to kill them. In the 40s or the 50s or the 60s, an Israeli opening to Saudi Arabia would have been extraordinarily. Was absolutely, what they should have worked to do. If they obviously it was impossible, but it would have been world changing. That's not what Israel is in 2019. Like Israel is basically the regional hegemon in 2019. It is one of the least threatened countries on the planet. Yeah, a lot of rhetoric threatening Israel, but because of 70 years of development of sort of turning that place into a fortress. Sociologically, politically, physically. Israel is not in danger at all. So I think that it's interesting, the sort of, you'll see a lot of excited, and I think as Saudi Arabia becomes more and more desperate, it's something that they're going to rely on more and more. You're going to see a lot of excited reporting about Israeli-Saudi peace efforts over the next year or so. And it's interesting because I think it tarnishes both countries, honestly. Like, I just think it's one of the only redeemable things about the Saudi royal family and Saudi Arabia generally was the. And I've never really thought about this before actually reading Bruce Riedel's book. One of the only redeemable things about them was their dedication to the cause of the Palestinians, and their abandonment of that cause. It's not wise. And the Israelis, cozying up to Saudi Arabia, it's insane. It just makes no sense. Anyway, more questions. Victory asks about Yemen war. Who will take control in Yemen? Man, I wish I knew. I do not. I think the Houthis already took control in Yemen, pretty fundamentally, and that's one of the really irritating things about this sort of Yemen war is that it's pitched as this civil war or this confusing thing. Who knows? Yeah, it's pitched as this sort of civil war, and the Saudis like to pitch themselves as sort of liberating or making things better or something along those lines. And that's not what happened. What happened? I mean, the Houthis had pretty much taken control of the entire country in 2015. The civil war had happened; it had been won, and the Saudis have spent the past almost 4 years now. God, almost 4 years now, brutalizing the Yemeni people to roll back um, something that had already happened, and they're failing to roll back something that had already happened. It's obscene. As bad as it would be if the Saudis had managed to intervene in 2015 and taken out the Houthis, and it would have been a bad thing, bad precedent, bad this, that, and the other thing. At least it would have been over. But to just the past 4 years of extraordinary incapacity. The Saudis love to talk about, the Iranians. I was looking at this, Bruce Riedel, the book I was reading. I mean, this is a guy who worked for the CIA, worked for the U.S., is very locked into the Saudi narrative. He says that the Iranians give like $10 to $20 million to the Houthis every year. $10 to $20 million. That is nothing. Nothing. The Saudis, I think this figure $5 billion fits in my head. Is that how much the Saudis spend in Yemen every month? I'm not, I don't have the figures at my fingertips, but Jesus. So it's pretty horrific. I think, I called it Yemen, a better story. I think it's the 5th episode in my Yemen series. I talk about the way that actually what I think Yemen, the war in Yemen is 2 wars of independence. It is a war of northern Yemen against Saudi aggression. It's a war of independence from northern Yemen from Saudi Arabia, and it's a war by southern Yemen for independence from northern Yemen and from Saudi Arabia and the UAE. I think it's 2 separate independence wars. I would ideally like to see. I would have no problem with Yemen breaking up again, especially because that seems to be what a lot of Yemenis want. That's my guess. I don't know, man. I tend to get very intense on a topic and dive in on it for a couple weeks, but I don't have the most retention. This week I'm really focusing on my upcoming book, Avoiding the British Empire. So if you got any questions about like medieval, early modern, and modern European politics, like I'm pretty good. But Yemen is not at the front of my mind right now. Shivansh, I think, Shivansh had a question, I believe, about India and Pakistan. Sorry, there's a lot of people here. That's amazing. The things are going past. Shivansh, do you want to ask your question again? I'll try and catch it. Mike Hunt asks, can someone give me a quick summary as to why Yemen united in the first place? Well, Mike Hunt, I have a series. Mike Hunt. It could be your name. But still, it's great name. I have a series. If you go to my channel and click on playlists, there's a big series on Yemen that talks about the past. To some degree, it talks about the past 500 years of Yemeni history, but it goes in great detail with Salah and all that. So look at that. Okay, Stefan asks, why does Saudi Arabia spend so much on its military? That's part of the sort of the deal. I've characterized Saudi Arabia as sort of a U.S. colony. And that's Saudi Arabia spends a ton of money. Rather the U.S. buys a lot, or the U.S. used to buy a lot of Saudi Arabian oil and provides defense to the country. And in return, Saudi Arabia scoops a lot of that money back into the U.S. economy. That's sort of how it's happened for quite some time. The Caspian Report had a really great video, and I think the geostrategy of Saudi Arabia or something like that, that talked a lot about the sort of fundamental uselessness of the Saudi military. He wouldn't, put it that way. He's a much more measured and unbiased person. There's a great Caspian Report on the Saudi military or some geopolitics of Saudi Arabia that talks a lot about that military. But what's extraordinary is they buy all this incredible equipment. They need U.S. support to even operate it. In the Yemeni war, it's not just refueling. The U.S. Has, U.S. contractors, I assume, are maintaining all the equipment that's doing the bombing. And also the Saudis, this is the point that Caspian Report makes really well. The Saudis block, intentionally keep their military stupid. I was appalled to learn. They intentionally keep their military from attaining any real independent power or capability because they're terrified of coups. And that was a more serious problem, especially in like the era of Arab nationalism and Nasser. The Saudi military, would so it's actually it's born out of a real problem. And also comes down to the fundamental ridiculousness of the Saudi state of having a sort of Bedouin monarchy running a country of 30 odd million in the 21st century. Like this military is a threat to them. So they overfund it and don't do anything. Okay. Air Blue asks, KSA plus Pakistan for Iran, something fishy is going on there. I don't understand that question. Okay, Shranch. Okay, but Pakistan's saying they will take revenge for what? Civilian casualty was 0, so they want revenge over dead terrorists? There's nothing more terrifying to me than what India and Pakistan are doing right now. It's just, it was so much ink or digital, so much ink and so many bytes are wasted on the sort of farce that is, U.S. versus North Korea. That's not something that's really going to be a war. That's not something that's really going to happen. But India, Pakistan, that's something that happens all the time, and they are both nuclear. They are both nuclear powers. As I've said over and over and over again, I really need to do more reading before I can talk about India and Pakistan at all. However, with this British Empire project, I've been learning a lot about, India and Pakistan's 19th century. That's for sure. So I'm getting there, but I'm just not there yet, and I can't do it. So when I started seeing those reports from yesterday, I was panicked because and like I said, I don't know what's going on with India and Pakistan. But having looked into it a little more, some of you guys chimed in on Twitter and whatnot. It seems like this isn't going to blow up into something bigger. Seems like. I don't know. But I'm going to trust you guys because I don't know enough about India and Pakistan. Keith Jones asks, will the United States turn on Saudi Arabia? We should have turned on Saudi Arabia like about 17 years ago, after 9/11. No, we shouldn't have invaded. We shouldn't have done anything like that. We should have just backed off. We should have just stopped collaborating with Saudi Arabia. We should have just stopped working with them as closely as we do. I've got a video saying I think Saudi Arabia is more of a threat than Iran is, or something like that. I think we should treat Iran and Saudi Arabia the same. We should not sanction either of them. We shouldn't constantly threaten to invade either of them. But at the same time, we shouldn't cozy up to these medieval theocracies. We shouldn't treat Saudi Arabian sort of political urges and wishes as vital to U.S. security. They're not. So I think we should treat Iran a lot better, and we should treat Saudi Arabia nowhere near as good, and sort of treat them the same. Just sort of treat them like other countries, and let them succeed or fail on their own power. So yes, I would like it if the U.S. abandoned Saudi Arabia. Depends on what you mean by abandon. I'm firmly opposed to any kind of not, who knows? Maybe there's something out there. Maybe there's a, when I see the details, I'll find a regime change operation that I like, or an intervention that I like. But I haven't seen one yet. I guess obviously World War II is a good one. But there's a lot of reasons that's different. Those countries actually invaded other countries, which very few targets of regime change nowadays have. Kaivan Rahat is objecting to medieval theocracy. Yeah, I think I would call Saudi Arabia a medieval theocracy. And that is unfair, actually. You're right. I mean, both of these countries, Saudi Arabia and Iran, have tremendously educated people. Iran probably more so, but anyway, with tremendous capabilities, tremendous abilities. They are both ruled by systems. Saudi Arabia much more so than Iran, that have elements of medieval theocracies. And maybe I should be a little more careful. Maybe I should be a little more careful in throwing those terms around, but there are elements of both Iran and Saudi Arabia that I see as just wrong. And maybe that's a little bigoted on my part. Maybe that's a little racist. But I think it's sort of been shown that while like an extremist state is, other terms maybe I should be more careful with, doesn't really deliver the goods. Iran isn't in great shape, and I think that the folks that run Iran right now owe their continued power to threats from the United States. So anyway, I'm getting off the topic. The question was, will the U.S. abandon Saudi Arabia? And that depends on what you mean. I'm absolutely firmly opposed to any kind of intervention in Saudi politics. If the State Department wants to, openly, talk to different elements of the Saudi royal family or whatever, like above board, okay. But as far, CIA bullshit, military intervention, none of that should ever be applied really to any country at this point. Well, maybe China. I don't know. That's a whole other question. And I think we're kind of the bad guy in that relationship as well. I'm very consistent. But as far as Saudi Arabia, we should distance ourselves. And what's exciting is over Yemen. That's the most important thing right now. And I haven't done a video in like a month now, and it's unfortunate. I should really get back into Yemen. Stopping the war in Yemen, I think, is the next step. Is just stopping the starvation, the murder of those people. That is a concrete step away from Saudi Arabia that we should make, that most of Congress acknowledges we should make. And after that, after that bleeding has stopped, then we can start hopefully stepping away from other dumb things that we do, like our antagonism of Iran. So as far as like, will the US ever abandon Saudi Arabia? I mean, it is a long-standing relationship. It is a positive. Should we abandon the Saudi royal family? Yes. Nobody in Washington, D.C. wants to do that. It's fascinating because there's Bruce Riedel, read his book. I believe it's Karen Elliott House. I actually went and saw her speak. There are these very savvy, incredibly learned people who know Saudi Arabia like the back of their hand. I couldn't even dream to get anywhere close to the knowledge and depth of experience that these people have. And their books are tremendously valuable to me. And I wouldn't understand a goddamn thing about Saudi Arabia without Karen Elliott House. And, now Bruce Riedel has, I think, really thrown another dimension. And I've read a bunch of books on Saudi Arabia. Ton of reporting, ton of reports. But those two figures in particular stick out in my head because they see the problems. They analyze it, rigorously. They know it. But at the same time, they've spent their professional lives living and dealing with the Saudi people, not the Saudi people, I mean, to a limited extent, but the Saudi elites. And that means the Saudi royal family. So even these tremendously savvy, brilliant people who've added so much to my understanding of Saudi Arabia are bought in to the Saudi royal family. And I'm not talking about bribery or anything like that. It's just they are their friends. They are the people they know and have worked with for 40 years. So that's what we're fighting about. That's the problem in Washington, D.C. now, is that even people who see the problems are bought in to the Saudi royal family. And, the Trump administration has been bought by Saudi Arabia, as far as that goes, as I talked about earlier. So that is that's the problem in Washington, D.C. right now. That's the problem with Washington, D.C. in a lot of ways. It's inertia. Washington, D.C. just keeps on fighting the Cold War against Russia, keeps on seeing China as, these scary Chairman Mao people, because these institutions are built to fight the Cold War. Whether we're talking about think tanks, whether we're talking about the Belfer Center at Harvard, whether we're talking about, the State Department, certainly the Defense Department. It's all built around needing an enemy, and Iran is the only enemy we've got left. So that's the big fight, is trying to get Washington, D.C. to acknowledge that the Cold War ended. The Saudi Arabian relationship made sense. I think my next project is really diving in on the Cold War. After doing the British Empire, I'm going to do the U.S. Empire in detail. But I do believe, and I've got a video, Why the Cold War Must Be Remembered. I do believe that it was, though it's sometimes oversold, and certainly after the 60s or so, the Soviet Union didn't really present the threat that we pretend it did. But in the 40s and 50s, the Soviet Union took over continents. We didn't know it at the time. We didn't know at the time that China and the Soviet Union would end up being enemies. But China went communist in 1949. Eastern Europe was controlled by the Soviets. I mean, it was a real threat. And at that point, the Saudi-US relationship made sense. It hasn't made sense since 1989. And that's part of the larger problem, that Washington, D.C. still hasn't changed up from the Cold War at all. So anyway, Janoy Crespa asks, how come the so-called ISIS group claims to despise Israel in the West, yet somehow only attacks Syria, Iraq, Turkey, Iran, and Egypt? Did they somehow get lost? Well, I've talked a lot about, I think most recently I said, I've got a video called Everybody's Lying About ISIS. And yeah, sort of jihadi terrorism is this just absurd. It's absurd to pretend that it has this independent existence outside of the Saudi-US relationship. If you look at the two big spikes and formative events for the ideology of ISIS and Al-Qaeda, you have two things. You have the US sponsored and Saudi funded, sort of US organized, Saudi funded, Pakistan as well, war in Afghanistan in the 1980s, and you've got the war against Assad. I mean, terrorism, jihadi terrorism, radical Islamic terrorism is an outgrowth of US and Saudi policy. That's just obvious. Local Cool Extreme asks, More Freedom Foundation, why is China slumping politically and economically? Authoritarian states are great at playing catch up. If they've got, not necessarily, some authoritarian states have been great at catch up. One of the facts that made the Soviet Union so scary was that in the 30s, 40s, and to some extent the 50s, they industrialized Russia. I mean, Russia under the czars certainly started on industrialization. I think at the beginning of World War I, they finally completed, a train route across Russia, like the Trans-Siberian Railway, like only was something that the czars managed towards the end. And it was an agrarian empire. It was big, it was scary, but it was a bunch of farmers primarily, with just a little bit of sort of modernity being built on top. The Soviets industrialized Russia. The Soviets had, a version of the Chinese miracle as well. And then once they'd sort of, built up the industry, built up the cities, brought up literacy, that sort of thing, there was sort of like, huh? And I think China's sort of at that moment as well. They've built those empty cities. They've built their electronic rail. They've played the catch-up game. And I think they've probably gotten about as far as they can get through that, because it is the capitalist free enterprise system. I know I am a neoliberal, but it is the capitalist free enterprise system that sort of, this is a bit arrogant, but sort of builds the future and sometimes there's that great Adam Curtis documentary, Century of the Self or whatnot, that sort of, in order to profit, creates wants and needs, creates new things for people to aspire to and pay for and buy. And an authoritarian system like the Soviets, in the 50s, or the Chinese now, sort of, once they've done the obvious stuff, sort of runs out of stuff to do. Fife Bilby asked, what's a neoliberal? Which is a tremendously difficult question. I've got a video, I think, called What is Neoliberalism, which is me arguing with John Coombs, a much more left-leaning guy, about what that actually means. So that's a long conversation. I've got a 20-minute video on that you can check out. Okay, questions. Have we got some more questions? And you see, that's Jasper Scott says, builds the future. The Chinese has private enterprise too, and it also pumps gigantic amounts of public money into venture capital. Your analysis is unsophisticated on this point, but that's a key thing. So China right now used private enterprise aspects for its rise. Absolutely, no question. And yes, they pump a tremendous amount into R&D. They're supposedly attaining leadership on things like quantum computing and alternative intelligence. I have forgotten what AI stands for. Automated? That's embarrassing. What does AI stand for? Wow, that's a brain fart. But so they've been moving forward on stuff like that. Ray Quissa, ask your question again, please. So the Chinese, yes, but what's interesting right now is because the Chinese perceive how shaky things are getting, they are making a turn towards harsher authoritarianism. The Xi Jinping president for life thing, which I think is going to prove to be fairly fragile, as part of that transition, as part of the abandonment of the governing system that had served China so well over the past 4 decades, as part of that abandonment and going for a president for life, there's been a turn back towards state-owned enterprises. And the private enterprise that built China's miracle is now being sort of clamped down on. I mean, I guess you can go back to Lenin and his new economic plan that was sort of capitalist and then was abandoned. Anyway, but yeah, I mean, this is, yes, obviously it's not, it's a little oversimplified to say that, China is incapable of doing anything. They're great at like big industrial plans. They're great at like, pumping money into, CRISPR and biogenetics, biotech stuff. And they can do that well. But now, as they're getting shakier and more concerned about economic growth and, their role in the world, they're getting more authoritarian, which will not work out for them. And I do believe that sort of capitalist systems are just better at figuring out what's next. I mean, in the 50s and 60s, we had this terrible, the Russians, the Soviets got way ahead of us as well. It was the Soviets that launched the first satellite. It was the Soviets that put the first man into orbit. And then, there was a real concern about Soviet leadership. But then it was sort of the capitalist system and entrepreneurialism that, turned the internet and, smartphones into a thing. And that's true. That's only the most obvious one. That's true on a whole range of, business innovations and technology and this, that, and the other thing. So while, yeah, I think that on things like, like Sputnik or, the space program, an authoritarian system like China, like AI and quantum computing and some biotech applications, China can definitely still be powerful and impressive. But I do think that as far as, salesmen, I say this a lot, salesmen are the most important people. Oh, my hair, what is going on with my hair today? Like salesmen are the most important people in any economy. Just the ability to make people want shit. And it's the applications where, folks fall down. The U.S. economy managed to get it together to get to the moon, but what was more importantly was all of the innovations that came out of getting to the moon, in computing and whatnot. It was the capitalist system that could sort of turn that into, fucking social media. Whereas more authoritarian, not even authoritarian, more sort of state-based. France has got a lot of failures on this. France was sort of, remember Minitel? France was leading on a lot of technology stuff in the 80s. but then just sort of fell behind because it wasn't as rapidly capitalist as the United States was. So yeah, and I'm not an uncritical supporter of the U.S. capitalist model. I think for the past 40 years, I don't know if we've gone too far, but we've certainly gone heavily into a sort of, neoliberal Anglo-Saxon economics sort of, pro-business direction. I think it probably is time in the United States to sort of switch and, do a little more social spending, figure out, how to spread the benefits of what we've done over the past 40 years better. So, it's give and take. Six Bullet is bad at Destiny says, do you think America will end up like the Roman Empire and Russia and China know this? I don't think America will end up like the Roman Empire. I'm writing this whole book, Avoiding the British Empire, and it's one of the initial chapters talks about how the model of Rome is actually quite silly. For 500 years, and I did a TEDx talk on how important knowing about Rome and how people have thought about Rome for the past 500 years is. But as far as like a direct model for what's going to happen to the United States, no, that's not there. Actually, Thucydides, and I have been thinking I need to go back and read Thucydides because he talks about how the Athenians, after winning their big struggle against Persia, sort of got more and more oppressive of the other Greeks and ended up blowing itself up. And I see some real parallels with the U.S. today, but that's only in a small arena in terms of diplomacy and approaches to the world. As far as like the broader, like, is the U.S. Rome? Is the U.S. going to fall the way Rome did? I think that's just flatly ridiculous. I mean, saying that there's direct lessons to be learned from the experience of a agrarian slave empire from 2,000 years ago. No, I don't think that makes sense. Question Victory asks, your analysis about northern Syria, will Turkey invade? I mean, Turkey has already invaded. And I think that Turkey has put itself in a pretty uncomfortable position, sort of in the name of these old Ottoman dreams or what have you, like this, this memory of the Ottoman Empire that's become more and more prevalent in today's Turkey. Honestly, Turkey's already done more invading of northern Syria than I expected, but I think there's a limit there. And it was interesting, famously, I think Erdogan and Trump were having a phone conversation, and Erdogan was like, "Oh, get out of Syria," and Trump was like, "You're right. We should get out of Syria." And Erdogan was like, "Sorry, this Erdogan, the president of Turkey, was like, oh, wait a second, I'm not that sure about it," because the problem is if the U.S. leaves Syria, then Turkey just has to deal with Russia itself, and that it's easy for Iran, Russia, and Turkey to sort of get together and have their Astana process and whatnot when they're sort of thumbing a nose at the United States and sort of blocking what the U.S. wants to do in Syria. But if the U.S. wasn't in Syria, then Turkey, Iran, and Russia would have to decide the future of Syria. And that, I think, gets a lot more fraught and a lot more difficult. And honestly, for sort of the history of the world and the U.S. stepping back a bit, I think that Turkey, Russia, and Iran should decide the future of Syria. But as far as like further invading, I think that the war in Syria has achieved a certain level of stasis because a lot of the areas that are controlled by stateless actors are disappearing. Now, I guess the Islamic State is a state, but basically what I'm talking about is actors that don't have a sponsor in a great power. The Kurds have the U.S. still, and now, unfortunately, still do, because we're, for some reason, keeping a couple hundred soldiers in Syria. The parts of parts of Syria, northern Syria, that are controlled by the Turks have an outside sponsor. The Assad government has an outside sponsor. What happens to Idlib is a very interesting question, but that's, I think the war in Syria, I hope, is to some degree over. We'll see. That could be completely wrong. Hmm. Shivansh Natiel asks, what is your view on Brexit? I did a whole series on Brexit 2 years ago, saying it'd be a terrible idea if it happened. And I agree. I think it's a terrible thing. I think that the mess of British politics right now is difficult to understand. I won't even attempt to describe it now, but they are screwed. And just Brexit is such a terrible, terrible idea. In my book, Avoiding the British Empire, in chapter 6, I go through all of the different times where you can say all the different candidates for the year that the British Empire ended. 1997 when they handed over Hong Kong, 1968 when they abandoned all of their military bases east of Suez, 1956 with the actual Suez crisis when the United States smacked down Britain and France for trying to do imperial stuff in Egypt. 1945, I would go with actually 1914, but the most recent candidate for that, I think, is 2016. What's important, what was always probably more important to the British Empire than the formal empire, than the places that had a British flag on it, was its informal empire, its tremendous financial influence and power in the world, and its ability to sort of get countries that weren't technically part of the British Empire to do things. And I think in 2016, with the Brexit vote, the United Kingdom chose to give up its last piece of informal empire. I've said in the past that the United Kingdom is essentially a finance industry with a country attached, and I'm afraid that that's not entirely true, but that's mostly true. It's such an absurdly stupid thing for the United Kingdom to just sort of voluntarily give that up. There are a lot of people who just sort of insist that, oh no, London as a financial capital is much more important than the EU, and I just think that's simply not true. English is important; it's the international language of business, but it's been that way for about 50 years, and everybody speaks English. Not obviously in every country in the world, but in every sort of financial and legal business, in the world, unless it's a country like China and Germany that's big enough to sort of have professionals that don't speak English. Those countries also have many professionals that speak English. So yeah, just because the United Kingdom has English doesn't mean they're going to hold on to their financial industry. The reason that London was a big financial capital was, yes, all the other stuff was important. You can find agreements governed by UK law all over the world. But the most important thing, the main thing underpinning that, was the fact that it was the financial capital of the European Union. And that's not about, special skills that, the London bankers have. That's that's regulatory. That's because it was part of the common market. And it was that London had all of Europe, which I don't think anymore, but up until 2008 was a larger economy. The EU altogether was a larger economy than the United States. And London was the financial capital of that. So yeah, signing that over is nuts. So yeah, Brexit was a terrible mistake. I think it's probably going to happen. There's all kinds of hopes and dreams that maybe they'll do another referendum, and I still hope that that'll happen and Brexit won't happen. But I think Brexit is going to happen, and I think that is the final end of the British Empire. I think Brexit is the thing that makes the European Union, Brexit is the thing that makes the United Kingdom just some island off the edge of Europe, finally, after an extraordinary history of tremendous power. I think Brexit kind of ends it. Bilolor bin Dirilir asks, do you think Barbie will conquer both sides of America in 2069? I have no idea what you're even talking about, but I like that. I like throwing a bomb in there. I have no idea what you're talking about. Bilolor bin Dirilir. No idea what you're talking about. Six Bullet is bad at destiny says, do you think an Islamic caliphate will emerge with Turkey within 100 years? I would say absolutely not. I would refer you to a video I have that says why Turkey will never be Saudi Arabia. I think an Islamic caliphate, I think that's probably a likely result of the end of the Saudi monarchy. I think that if you want an Islamic caliphate, I think there's a distinct chance of it as the successor state to Saudi Arabia. But I also think that the Islamic caliphate within 100 years, I think 100 years from now, the possibility of an Islamic caliphate will look so tremendously silly. It will look exactly as silly as the idea of well, I don't know, maybe that'll look less silly, but you know, in the 1890s and early 1900s, there were these anarchist terrorists who wanted to set up a system of anarchy, sort of left-leaning, and not entirely clear what they thought they were doing. But yeah, I think that's about you know, us living today under an anarchist collective is about as realistic as talking about an Islamic caliphate 100 years from now. I think that Saudi Arabia, it's a possibility that they'd have some kind of Islamic caliphate, but if everyone else was smart enough to just sort of let them go about it and, you know, fail miserably under that system, then they'd get sick of it. They'd grow out of it. I think we've seen that both in the two most enthusiastically fundamentalist countries we've seen, Iran and Saudi Arabia, both of which were only really possible because of oil wealth. People are sick of it. You know, I don't have data at my fingertips, but my understanding is that in Iran, the Islamic Republic, nobody goes to the mosque anymore. I think that the idea of setting up some fundamentalist, you know, 7th century medieval theocracy can be appealing, can create a lot of energy, as we saw with the Islamic State. I mean, yes, that more than anything else, that's a result of US, Saudi, CIA policy, but there were people who got really invested in it, and there was a lot of energy behind it. You know, you can have the foundation of Saudi Arabia in the 20s, you know, them taking the holy cities relied on religious fanaticism. And that stuff can only take you so far. It burns out. At the end of the day, you're left with a system that just doesn't make any sense in the modern world. It's been tried. Saudi Arabia, to some extent, tried to set it itself up as an Islamic state. Iran, to some extent, in 1979 and after, tried to set itself up as an Islamic state. And, you know, they've both failed. You know, and you can see this in the history of Christianity as well. Like, if you want the reason that Europe is much more atheist leaning and agnostic leaning than the United States is because they all had official religions. Most of the states, the United Kingdom still today has an established official church. You know, the king supposedly leads the English church and will tell you, you know, how you're supposed to believe in God. And the result of that has been atheism. You know, in Germany, actually, if you want to talk about a religious state, in Germany, I believe both the Catholic and Protestant churches are still tax supported, and which is nice because it keeps a lot of you know, beautiful old architecture preserved. And there's no other way to do that because you know, Germans don't go to church much. I mean, that's vast oversimplification, but they certainly don't go to church enough to support the infrastructure of beautiful old churches that Germany has. So yeah, the idea of a religious state just isn't really viable this century. I mean, who knows? Anything's possible. It's possible that like the next technological paradigms, you know, when we start altering, you know, who we are biologically, then maybe, who knows, maybe a religious, you know, more religious states are possible after that. But I would be very surprised if we were to see 100 years from now any kind of state that was based on medieval poetry, be it the Quran or the Bible. Yeah. Logo Cool Extreme asks, will the Middle East still achieve peace post-Saudi Arabia? Won't Iran, Turkey, and Egypt compete against each other and cause more chaos? No, I don't think. I think that it makes sense for the Middle East to be sort of run in some kind of competition between Iran, Turkey, and hopefully, if it ever gets its act together, Egypt. Egypt as sort of the most populous Arab state. Um, I would be okay with actually some unification of Arab states because I think that Arabs deserve freedom as well. I think it would be a shame if we sort of just jumped back, to 1914 and the Middle East power being divided between Turks and Persians. I want Arabs to have self-determination and freedom as well, but I do think it's very possible by just sort of following the models that we put together in these 70 years of peace since 1945. I think it's very possible for Iran, Turkey, and Egypt as sort of sane countries to find a way to deal with each other and compete peacefully, economically, and bring peace and development to the Middle East. I think that's very possible. I think there are a lot of people who work very, very hard to keep that from happening. It was really just being emphasized to me, like, what happened to the Arab Spring? I made it 3 years ago, but I still believe this. I put up a video that said why I still love the Arab Spring. What happened to the Arab Spring was, yes, there were it gave power to a lot of lamentable groups. Maybe the people we wouldn't like were the most organized and ready to take advantage of it. But what really happened to the Arab Spring is Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Qatar got together to crush Arab democracy. That's what happened. And it's exactly what happened after 1815 in Europe. The sort of old, the old royal families got together to crush any revolutionary, democratic, future-leaning inclinations. So yeah, I mean, we sort of there's this assumption that the Middle East's natural state is like being a screwed up disaster, and it's not. It's a screwed up disaster because competing powers from the Gulf states to Israel to Turkey to the United States to Iran have worked very hard to keep it a disaster. So no, I do think it's possible for a post-U.S. hegemony Middle East to attain something like peace. More Freedom Foundation asks, is a united Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, maybe Kuwait possible? Yes, I think it's possible. There's a lot of stumbling blocks for that. There's got to be some kind of accommodation between Israel and the Arabs. I think there's a lot of folks who dream that Israel is somehow going to be, the U.S. is going to give up on it, and Israel will be wiped away, and that's simply not realistic. That's not how things are going to work. I think we're already seeing aspects of the Israelis cozying up to China, cozying up to India. I mean, if you want China and Israel have so many natural affinities. Just compare the Uyghurs to the Palestinians. Chinese are really good at stuff and defense technology. The Chinese like that. So yeah, this idea that Israel is just going to go away is kind of silly. And what's really, once again, reading this book, Kings and Presidents by Bruce Riedel, was just looking back at it and realizing, God, how close they were. Like, I mean, there were multiple plans on the table where if Israel would just give up its occupation, every Arab country would have been like, fine, we recognize you. Let's start the peace thing. That can seem impossible now, but I think it's very possible. So obviously, before we're going to talk about a pan-Arab state, or sadly, probably before we're going to talk about maybe before we're going to talk about meaningful democracy in places like Egypt and Saudi Arabia and Syria, we're going to have to talk about Arab-Israeli peace, which is obviously sort of something people have been trying for quite some time. But I do believe it's very possible. IvarX asks, what will happen with Russia? Will it be China's province? I've got a video from like 4 years back that says that within 30 years, Russia will be in the European Union. Now, I'm no longer as confident as I was back then that the European Union will still exist, I guess, 25 years from now. But there will be some kind of organization of European states. And I think Russia's natural home is with those states. Because, yeah, as your comment, I think, points to, the Russia in Europe is a big player. Russia can sort of throw its weight around. Russia can, be a part of building a European future, that sort of thing. If Russia tries to organize its future with China, its future is as just another stand. It's like Turkmenistan or Kyrgyzstan or Kazakhstan. It's just another satellite of China. So it is in Russia's long-term sort of geostrategic interests to cozy up to Europe, and I think that's what's going to happen. Boost asks, Mo, what are your thoughts on World War III? Is it going to happen or not? World War III is not going to happen in the 2020s or this year. I think a nuclear exchange between India and Pakistan is something that we should all be very worried about and is a distinct possibility. And that's potentially civilization ending, isn't it? Yeah, I think Iran and Pakistan have large enough nuclear capabilities that they could poison the entire world by killing each other. So that's something to worry about. But in the 2020s, like a real great power war, World War III, U.S. on one side, China or China on the other, and everybody else lining up against each other. That's not possible in the 2020s, I think, because the U.S. is still just too powerful. That's what I think. So in the 2020s, it's not going to happen. It was fascinating, looking at Syria and certainly on YouTube and further out into the fever swamps, a lot of people were talking about World War III is going to start in Syria. And even, I think you've got some U.S. Congress people talking about that. The idea being that, Russia and the United States were going to get into some kind of conflict that escalated out of control. I never thought that was possible because Russia is scoring points in the context of the U.S. not really caring that much about Syria. And at points where the Russia and the U.S. have, actually gotten into it, and they have in Saudi Arabia, in Syria. It was something that both the United States and Russia hushed up as quickly as possible. But, and it wasn't Russian soldiers, as, the Russians are very careful to not put many Russian soldiers in harm's way. But the United States military and their Kurdish allies killed a whole bunch. It's unclear. It could have been a couple dozen. It could have been a couple hundred Russian military contractors. So, we've already had conflict between the United States and Russia in Syria that involved a lot of dead Russians, but both Russia and the United States tried to cover it up because Russia can't escalate anywhere near to the degree that the United States can. Any war at this point. Now, is there a possibility of a war over Taiwan at this point that China would consider a good gamble? It's a possibility, but still probably not. I think that if China and the United States were to get into a war over Taiwan, off the coast of China, I still think probably the United States, the United States would not win, not because it doesn't have the capability, but because it doesn't have the willingness to lose the thousands of fighter pilots that would be necessary to win that war. So in very localized, things like India, Pakistan, China fighting with the US over Taiwan, those are possibilities for conflicts today. But a broader world war, China and Russia wouldn't risk it at this point because they know they can't win. There you go. Jasper Sky says 2 major military risks. 1, hair trigger weapon systems and consequent accidents. 2, automated weapons platforms and their intersection with automated surveillance systems. Absolutely true. Those are 2 major military risks. And of course, are scariest when it comes to nuclear command and control. That's something that I haven't done enough research on. I need to do more research on for sure, no question. But as we've seen, like when these scary escalation things happen, people thankfully do tend to back down. Like I said, the US killed a whole bunch of Russian military contractors in Syria like a year or so ago. People backed down. One of the most terrifying things that I think has happened in the past 10 years was when Turkey shot down a Russian jet. It was a very scary week there. And then both Turkey and Russia backed down very quickly. India and Pakistan this week, things look very scary, but they backed down quickly because people make the calculation that nobody can win that. When things change, and I think that's why I talk so much about Iran sanctions, is when the US screws up badly enough to organize the entire world against their interests, which is what has happened with the Iran sanctions thing. And that's just the start. This is something that would have to develop over decades. If the US continues on its current path of we can invade anywhere we want, we can do this, that, and the other thing, we can sign treaties and and crumple them up with the next president. If the US continues on that path, we're going to build over the next decade a stronger and more interconnected group of countries against us. At this point, it would have to be literally every country in the world banding together against the United States for a World War III thing to be possible. 10 years from now, after economic growth in China, after Europe getting sicker and sicker of the United States, then maybe World War III becomes more possible. But in the current, I don't think that's going to happen. Mahmoud Mahfouz asks, what are your thoughts on Libya and the French-Italian influence in the civil war there? I have gotten angrier and angrier about Libya. It's just this thing that just keeps on going. And it is atrocious that the world community, I think it's mostly because we're not keeping our leaders accountable. The Saudis and the UAE support some militias that compete with the Qatari militias, and the UN has got a government, and then Haftar's got a government. And everybody's supporting somebody different, and I have a sinister thought that maybe actually all the oil producing countries, including the United States, kind of like that Libya is a disaster because that keeps the oil markets tighter. I mean, that's a little conspiratorial, but I think it's possible. I think Libya is a problem that could be solved through a little international negotiation in a month. And it is atrocious, especially is another reason why the Gulfies want to keep Libya chaotic, is because Tunisia, Libya's next door neighbor, is the best chance. There's a real democracy going on in Tunisia, and it's failing to some degree because they're surrounded by basket cases. And if Libya had actually became a unified place, whether it was under a strongman or anybody, and started producing oil and started having real economic activity again, then many of Tunisia's problems would be solved. And we're not interested in solving it. I think I might be doing a video on that pretty soon. Umut Gezgin asks, Turkish and Greek relationship will be okay or not? Turkish and Greek relationship is one of the most fraught, violent, and nasty relationships. It's a serious competition. It's been horrible, and I think it's over. I think there's the classic, in the United States, we have sports rivalries, and there's some famous rivalries where one team thinks they still have a rivalry going, and the other team doesn't. Turks are still very angry at the Greeks, still suspicious of the Greeks, still can get score political points by with the Turkish public by doing nasty things to the Greeks. But it's essentially over. You just look at the relative size of their populations. You look at the relative size of their economies. No, I don't think is a real. I think Greece has been a spoiler for Turkey's aspirations to be closer to Europe. That's a real problem. But as far as like real competition between Greece and Turkey, I think that's essentially over. Just because Turkey is a much richer, bigger, more powerful country. It's like talking about the historic the historic rivalry between Germany and Belgium, or Germany and Luxembourg. If Greece doesn't get it, doesn't. Well, honestly, if the Germans don't let the Greeks get their shit together, then yeah, we're talking about Germany versus Luxembourg here. If that made any sense. DSM 0305 asks, do you think the EU is a better world leader than the United States? I think it could have been. I think the EU got a bit ahead of itself, and actually said stuff like, "Oh yeah, the euro is going to rival the dollar," this, that, and the other thing. And I would like the EU to be a better rival to the United States. I think it's better for the world economy. A healthy EU is better for the world economy. That's one of the main things that the world economy has been missing over the past 10 years. But I think the US and the EU have a tremendous amount in common and could work together to help build a better world. But the EU has, talk about the sick man of Europe, as an old formulation that used to be applied to the Ottoman Empire. The EU is the sick man of the world, and has been for quite some time now, which is really sad. And I would like the EU to get better. But at this point, no, EU is not a credible rival to US leadership. Oh, the Future 2050 says Sudan uprising. I did a video on Sudan about a month back, but I have not followed up on what's been happening the past week. My understanding is it's getting pretty exciting. Some people said, some people in the Sudanese government said, "Oh, Bashir is done," and Bashir said, "Oh no, I'm not done." This is the leader of Sudan for decades and decades. Yeah, that's getting very interesting. I really hope that the United States can stay out of it, and so far it seems like we are, which is good. Seems like, who knows? Ray QSA asks, will the Saudi Riyal USD exchange rate remain? Please answer. I don't know. I've said many times, I don't quite understand money, partly out of a suspicion that I don't think anybody really understands money. And the extent to which the petrodollar is or is not important, who knows? I did a video almost a year ago now called "What's an Economy," and it just sort of talks about how, we're at the point today with the whole study of economics that we were with medicine like 300 years ago. We've got some things that kind of work, like we know how to set a broken arm, but we believe a whole bunch of stuff that's just not true. There's a lot of developments. I think by the end of my life, we'll know a lot more about how an economy works, but we won't know everything. We still haven't cured cancer. What's going to happen with the Saudi-U.S. exchange rate? There are so many variables in there. It's not even something I'm looking at, I'll be honest. Sorry. Do you think the Saudis can buy or use the Pakistani military for their proxy war against Iran? That's al-Bloshi. That's once again, I was reading about that just last night. I was vaguely aware, but it was interesting reading the account. Saudi Arabia has spent a tremendous amount of money funding Pakistan, in Afghanistan and beyond that. I saw somewhere somebody said that actually it was the Saudis probably that funded Pakistan's nuclear program, which makes sense. So in the run-up to the war on Yemen in 2015, I can't remember if it was Abdullah. I don't think it was Abdullah because I don't think he really wanted a war in Yemen. But I think King Salman MBS approached Pakistan and were like, "Okay, we're invading Yemen. Give us the divisions we've earned by, giving you all this money over all these years." And the Pakistani government, I think, actually democratically, put it into the parliament. Okay, should we help? Saudi Arabia invade Yemen? And they said, no, we're not interested in antagonizing Iran to that degree. So no, I don't think. I think that Saudi Arabia is, for a very long time, thought they could rely on Pakistan to fight their battles for them. And I don't think Pakistan is interested, to their credit. I think it's a very distinct possibility that Pakistan could intervene to keep the Saudi royal family going. I think that would be a mistake. I think that it's a possibility that the Pakistani military could act as sort of a Praetorian guard in Saudi Arabia to shore up a shaky Saudi royal family. But as far as, taking the Saudi side in a war with, in a war with Iran? I don't think so, which is good, which is very good. DSM, oh no, that's a question for Jasper Sky, not me. AA asks, what's the best political move for Iran in long term and short term? Do you agree with Iran political actions? I think Iran, no, I mean, like, I think Iran has been incredibly reactive over the past 40 years. I think that it has, it's been under siege from the United States. There's no other way to look at it. The Iran-Iraq War was supported by the U.S., not so much initially, but after Saddam started losing, the U.S. and Saudi Arabia stepped up to keep him going. Yeah, the Iranians have been attacked by the United States and its allies almost unrelentingly for 40 years now. And their reaction to that, they've done a lot of things I don't like. They've done a lot of terrible things. But fundamentally, it's been self-defense. So I really like it as a U.S. voter, as an American who cares about these things. I think the first step to a better Iran is for the U.S. to just fucking lay off, you know? And I think when the U.S. does lay off, you know, Obama, despite the fact that he ended up doing the attack on one of Iran's only allies in Syria, when he first got into power, he was like, I want to talk to Iran. I want to, you know, let's try and hash this stuff out. And very quickly in 2009, you know, anybody remember the Green Revolution? Iran started looking shaky. The Iranian regime started looking shaky. And then, of course, once the Arab Spring happened and the United States started attacking Syria and doing the sanctions, then, of course, the Iranian theocracy got more and more powerful. So I'm more interested in how the U.S. can make it easier for the Iran to make better choices. I think it's very interesting what's happening now with the fact that even though Trump, it's been what, over a year now since Trump crashed out of the JCPOA, out of the Iran nuclear deal, Iran is still acting as if it's in force. I think they should continue to do that. I think a lot depends on what happens in 2020. If somebody comes to power in 2020 in the United States who tries to get back into the JCPOA, tries to start the process of peace with Iran, I think Iran will have the ability to make many, many, many better choices. I think a lot of the things that are characterized as aggressive by Iran aren't really aggressive. Shoring up Assad is not aggressive. You know, it's self-defense. Yeah. Hussein the Mesopotamian asks, what do you think about the future of Iraq and Syria? Unfortunately, I think the future of Iraq and Syria is more dependent on what the United States and Iran decide than anything else. And that's a goddamn shame. Those countries have suffered so much over the past decades at the hands of sort of geopolitical dick waving, you know, from Israel, Iran, the United States, Russia, Turkey, Saudi Arabia. That's sort of the reason why the Middle East is such a mess, is because in that region, more than anywhere else, the Cold War was never allowed to end. It's in the 1980s and 70s and 60s, there were 10 series going on all over the world because of geopolitical competition between the Soviet Union and the United States. The world got much better when that stopped. But in the Middle East, it never got better. So Iraq and Syria, man, what's so sad is you look back to like 2010, like right before, I mean, Syria was opening up, you know, Turkey was trying to create this, I guess, sort of, I don't know if common market is the right term, but at least a customs union between Syria and Iraq and Lebanon and Turkey. And God, that could have done so much. It could have been so great. I mean, Assad was open to, you know, opening things up more, was open to, you know, the beginnings of democratic stuff. You know, you could easily say that Assad was going to go on could have gone on the same trajectory that South Korea or Taiwan or any other of a number of countries that were run by dictators that sort of slowly faded into democracy and money. That could have been possible in 2010. But no, I mean, the future of Iraq and Syria is dependent on how badly Trump and Iran screws up Iraq and Syria. So, yeah. DSM 0305 says the U.S. is having peace talks with Taliban or about to leave. Do you think even after leaving, would the U.S. be willing to pay for the Afghan military? I read a big critique of the Afghan military recently. basically pointing out that the U.S. tried to build in Afghanistan a version of the U.S. military, and that's ridiculous. It's too dependent on U.S. aid. It doesn't make sense. I think that Afghanistan's future is probably with the Taliban, whether that's next year or 50 years from now. I am not confident that the U.S. is going. I mean, look at what happened in Syria. We were all very excited that the U.S. was going to leave. Now we're not leaving. And Afghanistan, I think, is a similar thing. Sure, we're talking to the Taliban. Sure, we've cut our troop levels, but I mean, who knows? I mean, Trump is terrible on a lot of things, but it's quite possible that we'll get some national security state Democrat in 2020 who's like, oh no, this time we're really going to go win Afghanistan. Of course, that would be insane, but it's possible. Local Cool Extreme asks, why should Germany bail out Greece for all its failure? Let them fix themselves. I think this gets down to the problems of the euro currency, because Greece, in very important ways, is not independent because of the euro currency, because of what's happened in Greece is an unprecedentedly horrific economic crisis. Because they had their crisis, they screwed up terribly. What should have happened was 4 or 5 years of terrible mess, and then they sort of restart things and things. That's what happens many, many times in sort of modern economic history. Greece can't do that because it doesn't control its own currency. It doesn't have any of the normal economic or political tools. Like, look at Argentina, one of the most egregiously poorly run places for the past 100 years. I think there's it's got a unique designation, a formerly developed country. In 1900 or around there, Argentina was one of the top 10 economies in the world, and it's just been so mismanaged for 100 years. But in 2000, I think, or 2001, they went completely bankrupt, defaulted on all their stuff. And did they do it again since then as well? But because they control their own currency and their own fiscal policy, they've been able to have these crises and then recover and sort of, keep limping along. And, hopefully one day they'll make it out of their sort of hellishness. But Greece can't do that. And that's dependent on the Germans. I think I've been reading a lot about fiscal policy recently, modern monetary theory, this, that, and the other thing, which I don't believe in, but I don't understand anything about currency and money. Once again, I don't think anybody does, but I think it's become very clear that one of Europe's main problems is Germany's refusal to run a expansionary, is that fiscal policy? Basically, for the past 5 years, the Germans have had massive surpluses. And I like fiscal responsibility. I think that the US right now is in this horrible, horrible position with trillion-dollar deficits every year. But some degree of deficit spending, especially when the euro economy is in a decade-long slump, is appropriate. That's sort of Keynesianism, basic Keynesianism. The reason that the world didn't completely implode after 2008 was because in Europe to a degree, and the US to a larger degree, and then to a massive degree in China, the degree to which China saved the world from 2008 is underappreciated. The governments were willing to spend more money. The German government is not willing to spend more money. The German economy in macro financial terms is in extraordinary shape, has a lot of leeway to do deficit spending, to sort of inflate the European economy, to get the European engine running again. And it has not done so for 10 years. And that's a tragedy, a tremendous failure of German leadership. And, you can understand why. The German hyperinflation of the 1920s, had a lot to do with the Great Depression, had a lot to do with the rise of Hitler, it was a terrible, terrible thing. You can understand why the Germans don't like deficit spending, but they should do a little bit of it. They should not have surpluses. They should push more money into the system to get the economic engine of Europe going. That's just basic. So the Greeks don't have that ability. The Greeks have no control over their own money. So that's why. No, no. Do I think that, from 2009 to 2012, I had zero sympathy for the Greeks? Fuck them. They screwed themselves. They absolutely did. They lied about their funding. They were given this bonanza of debt from, was it 2001 to 2009? And they abused it, and they needed to suffer for that. We're now over a decade later. Greece has experienced economic deflation and destruction that is unprecedented. And the reason they're still mired in that is because they don't have control. The Germans have control. So it's time to stop talking about, punishing the Greeks. The Greeks have been punished. And if the euro is ever going to reach anything like the potential that was promised, if the European economy is ever going to recover and allow Europe to take the leadership position that it's supposed to have, the Germans just need to, get over their 100-year-old paranoia about deficit spending and spend a little more money. So, yeah. AA, do you think if the Democratic president come in power in 2020, is it possible to come back in JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal? Also, if Iran comes to the table with Trump, how strong is it for him in 2020 election? Yes, I think it's possible to rejoin the JCPOA. The Europeans are doing their damnedest, and the Iranians are doing their damnedest to maintain it. I think it's very possible in 2020, and it's what should happen. The last part of that question, if Iran comes to the table with Trump, how strong is it for him in the 2020 elections? That's a very interesting question. I think that, no, I don't. Trump could absolutely win in 2020. Anything can happen. Looking at the current polling, and the standard response to that from Trumpkins and Republicans was like, oh, well, the polling was wrong in 2016. Actually, the polling wasn't wrong in 2016. Specifically, New York Times or 538 may have, they weren't even that wrong. They said there's a 1 in 10 chance that Trump will win, and he won. Saying a 90% chance of a Clinton victory is not saying there's no chance of a Clinton victory. I think people tend to misunderstand that. The way that the polls look right now is Trump definitely losing. Anything can happen between now and then. Obviously, with Trump specifically, we can make all kinds of predictions. But, Clinton was just such a uniquely weak candidate. So I think unless, barring, Trump shaking hands with the mullahs and then the mullahs falling and then, Iran, opening up to the world, dancing in the streets, which certainly won't happen in a 1-year time frame. Well, I'd be very impressed if that happened in a 1-year time frame. I don't think that that's going to have a significant impact. What is interesting is that Trump is just so willing to, mostly out of ignorance, kind of a good ignorance, throw over everything. The North Korea thing, I've not covered it because I just never thought anything would happen with it. But there's a distinct possibility that Trump could end the Korean War 60 years later. That would be a very good thing. And it is possible that Trump, I actually don't think it's possible because Trump is surrounded by such inveterate Iran hawks and haters that a Trumpian peace with Iran seems very unlikely. But it is intriguing. It is something to think about. Yes, I did say Trumpkins. I think that's a great way to talk about Trump. Corral Alexander says, sadly, just came in. What did I miss about Saudi Arabia? Well, we talked about it for hours. As soon as I end this, the whole presentation will be available on the YouTube channel. Guys, we have been doing this for about 2 hours and 10 minutes. That's on the long side. I've found that when people will watch, will click after the fact on something that's under 2 hours long, as it gets into 2 hours, 2.5 hours, they won't. So in the interest of more people watching, what I think has been a pretty good discussion, I think I should probably sign off. What can I say? Thank you so much. This has been tremendously successful. I'm excited to look at the stats. We've had 80 to 100 people watching all of 2 hours. That's a lot. I had a hunch that there was an appetite out there for some Saudi Arabia content, and you have it. Thank you so much for all of you for showing up and answering some such great questions. posing such great questions. Very civilized discussion in the chat. Looking forward to reviewing that later. And thank you guys so much. My name is Robert Morris. I essentially am the More Freedom Foundation, but no, it's not me. The More Freedom Foundation is me, and it is all of you. None of this would be possible without the comments, without the likes, without the interaction that I have with you guys here and on Twitter, on Instagram. It's you guys make this possible. You guys are the More Freedom Foundation, and I'm very grateful. It's amazing how much I learn from these conversations, and and trying to answer all the comments on these videos is really important to me. And it's amazing how much I learn about this stuff by interacting with all of you guys from all over the world. It's interesting. I did a live chat at like 7 p.m. last month, and 7 p.m. in the United States, which meant that the international people were asleep. And that was one of my worst watched videos in 2 years. I didn't quite realize just how international this live chat community is, and I'm really grateful for you guys. So thank you. My name is Robert Morris. I run the More Freedom Foundation. Every Tuesday, I upload a video. I do something. I've gotten this rhythm now where sort of for 4 weeks I do more produced content. Distinct argument, like 5 to 10 minutes. Very proud of those. I think you should watch those. And then I do a live, sort of giving myself a little break to work on stuff like the book project, every 5th week or so. So do a live chat once a month. But I'm really proud of the produced content. You should check that out at my channel, More Freedom Foundation. Please subscribe. Please click the button next to the subscribe button. I've also got an email list. I think all of this is in the description. You can sign up for. That will definitely have a lot more information. I keep meaning to do more with that, but that'll have a lot more information about the book, which will hopefully be coming out in the next couple months. I've already written a short book called Everybody's Lying About Islam that talks about the Saudi Arabia relationship with the United States in great detail and how that informs everything from radical Islamic terrorism to 9/11. It deals with a lot. I'd really recommend Everybody's Lying About Islam. You can find that on Amazon, both for the Kindle and in paperback form. Currently writing a book called Avoiding the British Empire, about how actually the main model for the United States is not Rome, it is the British Empire, because it was the first real world system controlled by one country, and we're now living in the second under the United States. So I sort of talk about what the British Empire was and what the US can learn from it. That will hopefully be out in the next couple months. It's something I promised for November of 2017, but has ended up being a slightly larger project than I had expected. You can find me here at this YouTube channel. You can find me on Twitter at RobboLaw. That's really been picking up over the past couple months. I interact with people every day on there. If you've got a question I didn't answer, hit me up over there, and I will try to do it in a small character account. So yeah, that's at RobboLaw. You can find me on Instagram at The Golden Age. Sign up for that email list in the description. I am also dependent for my livelihood on you guys. So if you would consider perhaps sending me some money through the PayPal link, also in the description below, or signing up for my ongoing crowdfunding thing through Patreon, I would be tremendously grateful. Yeah, I live in the United States again, and unfortunately I live in New York City in order to be closer to my parents and my siblings. That is not cheap, so I am definitely rocketing through savings, so it's important that folks chip in. Yeah, I'm tremendously grateful. This has been a great conversation. Thank you so much. And I think with that, I am going to sign out. So, and stop the broadcast. Thank you so much.